I'm Teresa.
And I'm Callista, and this is Terrifyingly Typical True Crime. Today, we're continuing with our theme of female killer nurses with the case of Genene Jones. Let's get into it. After her graveyard shift in the pediatric intensive care unit at Bexar County Hospital, now called University Health Hospital, in San Antonio, Texas, on an early morning in October of 1981, nurse Suzanne Maldonado stepped into the office of her boss, head nurse Pat Belko. Suzanne pleaded with Pat to listen to her. Too many babies were dying in the ICU, dying of problems that shouldn't be fatal. All the babies had one thing in common. They all died during the swing shift when fellow nurse Genene Jones was working. Pat had been anticipating this. She had been hearing talk for weeks about the number of deaths while Genene was on shift. She thought this was just gossip, and idle gossip wouldn't be tolerated. Some bad luck didn't equate to guilt. This was the pediatric ICU. They cared for the sickest of patients, and sometimes they died. But Suzanne was adamant. She had looked at the ICU census book, which listed the patients and their condition during their hospital stay. She insisted there were too many sudden emergencies, which led to patient deaths while Janine was working. Pat told Suzanne she would look at the census book. If she was correct, she would talk to Dr. James L. Robotham, the unit's medical director, and determine if an investigation was warranted. Pat located the census book, checked, and then double checked. Suzanne was right. Pat talked to Dr. Robotham about her concerns. He agreed there would need to be an investigation.
Who exactly were they investigating? The nurse in question, Genene Ann Jones, was born in Texas on July 13th, 1950. She was adopted by Dick and Gladys Jones shortly after her birth. Dick and Gladys also adopted three other children. They lived a comfortable life just outside of San Antonio. Dick seemed like quite the character. He was a nightclub owner and professional gambler. He is described as generous and larger than life. He also enjoyed spending money. This last trait may be what led to the nightclub's failure. In 1960, Dick got into some legal trouble when a safe with some cash and jewelry went missing from the home of a patron of the nightclub. The safe had been stolen while the regular customer was enjoying an evening at the nightclub. Dick was arrested, but said it had just been a practical joke.
Because being robbed is hilarious.
I mean, you gotta say something.
Yeah.
Luckily for Dick, the charges were dropped. Dick then started a billboard business and allowed Janine to ride along with him while he went to various locations around town to put up the billboards. Janine really enjoyed this one-on-one time with her father. Janine has said that her parents favored her siblings over her and referred to herself as the black sheep of the family. She would sometimes pretend to be sick to garner attention from her parents.
Janine was close to one of her siblings, her younger brother Travis. Travis loved being in Dick's shop and tinkering with things. At 14, he was in his father's shop and managed to craft a pipe bomb. The pipe bomb exploded and blew up in his face, killing him. Janine was 16 and consumed with grief. I mean, as you would be after an unexpected violent death like that. Then, when Janine was a senior in high school, Dick began to get sick. He was diagnosed with terminal cancer. He refused treatment and wanted to die at home. He lived through Christmas 1967, but died shortly after at the age of 56, a little over a year after Travis's death. Janine was devastated by the loss of both the people she was closest to in her family. She was still in high school, but felt that she needed a change in her life, and she needed it now. She asked her mom for permission to marry high school dropout Jimmy Harvey Delaney Jr. Her mom refused, saying it was too soon after the family's tragedies, and I'm with her. Singularly focused on escaping her family home, after graduation, Janine married Jimmy. After 7 months of marriage, Jimmy enlisted in the Navy. Janine was alone in Texas and depended on her mother for money. With Gladys's urging, Janine enrolled in beauty school. Jimmy returned home to Texas and they had a child. But 4 years later, Janine filed for divorce, indicating Jimmy had been abusive. They reconciled for a time before divorcing and going their separate ways. A little while after the divorce, her older brother died of cancer. Janine had a fear of cancer, and fucking fair enough. She was concerned about working with hair dyes and other chemicals as a beautician. She was also pregnant and concerned that these chemicals could affect her unborn child. And considering the chemicals humans have used on or around their bodies throughout history, I don't think that's completely irrational. We should also mention that information regarding the father of her second child and the actual birth dates of her children are scant.
One of the beauty salons Janine had worked in was in a hospital, so she decided she would return to school for nursing, deciding both parenting and schooling were just too much. She left her children with her mother. Janine received her licensed vocational nursing degree, but wasn't happy being a low rung on the nursing ladder. She was bossy and rude, lacking a kind bedside manner. Seems like maybe she picked the wrong profession, but anyhow,
Uh-huh.
uh, she was fired from several jobs before securing the fateful job at Bexar County Medical Center Hospital. Janine made no effort to befriend other staff at the hospital and wasn't well liked. In her first year at Bear, she made 8 separate nursing errors. These scarily included errors dispensing medication. Based on these errors, there was sufficient grounds to fire her.
Yeah,
I don't know. Is 5 okay, but 8's too many? Who knows?
who knows?
However, head nurse Pat Belko, for some unknown reason, liked and defended her. This gave Janine a feeling of fearlessness. She had someone in power on her side. Armed with her inflated sense of self, she tried bullying new nurses, and several transferred out of her department to get away from her.
As I would have.
Yeah, me too. Outside of her work, Janine went to several outpatient clinics complaining of a myriad of issues, which there was no diagnosis for. One doctor said her problems were all psychosomatic. In early 1981, Janine requested to be put in charge of the sickest patients. She seemed to thrive on the life and death excitement of an emergency. She also seemed to enjoy the process of preparing the bodies after death, and she liked to be the one to take the bodies to the morgue. Questioning things didn't seem to be a priority for the hospital. Medications at this time were not locked and were easily accessible. Additionally, contacting the previous hospital where Janine worked and was fired didn't seem of importance. I know that hospitals, like many employers, don't want to do their due diligence and inquire as to, why someone was fired. And many an HR manager will demur and not give specifics regarding someone's employment. But generally, they are at least able to answer if you would hire this person again. I mean, maybe they are afraid of over litigious individuals suing them. But there are some jobs that simply require more scrutiny, background, references, etc. And a nurse definitely falls into this category.
I 100% agree.
Yeah, who wouldn't? Maybe the hospitals, obviously. Co-
Yes.
Colleagues commented that Janine was skilled at putting intravenous tubes into veins. This made me cringe.
I'm sure.
I've been told that I have veins that twist, which makes it lots of fun when a medical professional has to turn and twist the needle to try and get I hate this phrase, a juicy vein.
It is a gross phrase. Or they have to call someone else in to help, so then you're sitting there waiting to be poked yet again.
Yeah, I mean, that really amps up my needle anxiety.
Mhm.
Janine also asked to attend special seminars regarding specialized drugs and asked a lot of questions. People were impressed by her continued interest in learning.
However, Janine's supposed quest for learning was soon overshadowed when staff started to realize that children were dying from ailments that should have been fatal during Janine's shifts. As we mentioned, per Janine's request, she was responsible for the most critical patients. During this time, many coworkers called Janine's shift the death shift, based on the numerous resuscitations and deaths that always took place under Janine's tutelage. Staff commented that Janine seemed to enjoy the power and attention of calling the parents to let them know of their child's death, and then would spend time commiserating with them. She also seemed to get excited,
Which is just so messed up.
yeah, when a child was near death. She wanted to be present when the child died. I have to say that with her working the swing shift, I have such an image of her as the Grim Reaper waiting in the twilight, but I probably just have an overactive imagination.
It's true.
As with any large workplace, gossip and rumors started spreading regarding the possibility that Janine was killing her patients. I'm not going to say we should pay attention to every rumor. Petty people make all kinds of shit up. But when it's about using your job to kill patients, maybe, just maybe, someone could think about looking into that. One such patient, 6-month old Jose Antonio Flores, came into the hospital with symptoms of fever, vomiting, and diarrhea. While under Janine's care, Jose started experiencing seizures and went into cardiac arrest. Thankfully, doctors worked tirelessly and were able to save him. They did note that his blood wasn't clotting, but eventually he was stabilized. During Janine's next swing shift, Jose again began having seizures and began to bleed. After Janine's shift ended the next morning, Jose's heart stopped beating. The cause of death was listed as unknown. Tragically, when a doctor told Jose's father about his baby's fate, he had a heart attack, but doctors were able to save him. Jose's blood was tested, and the results indicated that he had died of an overdose of heparin. Heparin is an anticoagulant, which is a blood thinner, but Jose's medical chart didn't indicate that this drug had ever been ordered.
Doctors noted another patient, 3-month-old Albert Garza, and most likely received an overdose of heparin. A doctor confronted Green and she became angry and left the hospital. And I'm not sure what other kind of job there is where a person in a higher position questions you and then you just leave, that you have a job to go back to. But, me and my annoying logic.
For real.
Thankfully, Albert recovered. The hospital put new parameters in place regarding the use of heparin, requiring precise documentation regarding use of the drug. Additionally, the ward decided that children whose conditions took a turn for the worse would be subject to additional lab tests to see if they had been administered unnecessary medication. In November of 1981, hospital administrators had a meeting where they discussed initiating an internal investigation of the pediatrics ward. However, that would require people entrusted with the health and well being of its patients to actually do their fucking job. They really didn't want to do that. They decided Dr. Robotham, who had been vocal about the need to look into Janine and the deaths that had occurred during her shifts, was simply overreacting. I mean, what if these suspicions leaked and the public heard about it? They just didn't want to risk it, so they did nothing.
Better safe than sorry when covering your ass.
Oh my freaking God, I swear the audacity of these lazy assholes. I mean, this is off topic, but for some reason, it made me think of the Parnell family who ran the Peanut Corporation of America. They knew some of their products contained salmonella. They did not want to lose money, so they went ahead and shipped out their product knowing it was contaminated. 9 people died and 700 people were sickened. The company filed for bankruptcy and 2 family members were sent to prison. I mean, we just live in a society where businesses, and don't think that a hospital is not a business, are greedy and self serving and would rather cover things up than do the right thing.
Yeah. That makes me think of Nestle's infant formula. It was marketed in countries where people didn't have widespread access to clean water, and hundreds of thousands of babies died. But, they were raking it in, so might as well do whatever sells. And that's a super high level overview. If you're interested, we first heard about it on Shorthand, another podcast hosted by Hannah and Cerruti, the hosts of Red Handed. They're the absolute best, so check both of those out.
They really are.
But back to Janine. Dr. Robotham was not easily swayed. He continued to keep an eye on records from Janine's shifts. He took special interest in the records of 11-month-old Joshua Sawyer. Joshua presented to the hospital with smoke inhalation after a fire broke out in his home. He suffered cardiac arrest, and doctors prescribed Dilantin. Although he was in a coma, doctors were optimistic about his progress. Janine had the gall to tell his parents that he would definitely have brain damage and they should just allow him to die. Shortly after this conversation, Joshua suffered 2 heart attacks and did die. Lab results would show he had a toxic level of Dilantin in his system. Dr. Robotham pushed to have Janine fired, but unsurprisingly, no one listened. Rolando Santos, a 1 month old baby being treated for pneumonia, began having seizures and substantial unexplained bleeding. Of course, all of these new and unexplained symptoms presented during Janine's shifts. When Janine was off for 3 days, little Rolando began to improve. Unfortunately, upon Janine's return to work, he began to hemorrhage and had a heart attack. Lab tests showed that he had an excessive amount of heparin in his system. He went into a coma and his blood pressure dropped dangerously low. However, a doctor was able to save him and ordered him to be removed from the pediatric ICU and placed under constant surveillance. With this move and surveillance, shockingly, Rolando's condition did improve, and he was stable enough to be released to his parents. Miracle of miracles, this 1 month old baby survived. But he was one of the few lucky ones.
Additional doctors complained to the administration that they thought Janine was killing children. The hospital was reluctant to do anything because, again, they didn't want any bad press. They did finally agree to form a committee to look into the problem. Squeaky Wheel Dr. Robotham, along with Pat Belko, were in charge. A team of investigators not affiliated with the hospital were tasked with looking into the suspicious deaths. Having a modicum of the oath they took to do no harm, medical staff knew there were enough unexplained events that they didn't want Janine to continue in their department. They also didn't want to directly deal with the problem. They decided before the committee was done with their investigation that they would simply replace all the LVNs in the pediatric ICU with RNs, giving the outgoing LVNs all good references. Janine, no longer able to work with the sickest kids, resigned. Her last day with Bear was March 17th, 1982. She decided to turn her life around and now spend her days attempting to atone for her crimes. Kidding, if only.
That's great. If only that's how these cases went.
But of course they don't. In Janine's absence, unexplained deaths at Bear stopped.
The investigation continued and discovered that there was definitely a problem. Between May to December of 1981, the investigation found that 10 children receiving care in the pediatric ICU had died after sudden and unexplained complications. In all 10 cases, Janine was at the bedside of each child. The report found, quote, the association of Nurse Jones with the deaths of the 10 children could be coincidental. However, negligence or wrongdoing cannot be excluded, especially because all the children seemed to die under peculiar circumstances. Children that had been stable prior to Janine's shift experienced serious medical emergencies and died during her shifts. Children would stop breathing, experience seizures, begin bleeding profusely when injected with a needle, or their blood would suddenly not clot. This couldn't be just a coincidence. When the report was released, Janine was no longer working in the pediatric ICU. In another example of always looking out for yourself and making sure to always cover your ass, hospital administrators fearing lawsuits or bad publicity did nothing, and also didn't call the police. There were pats on the back all around. Janine was gone. Certainly, she wouldn't go on to kill more children, but if she did, it wasn't their problem.
In late 1982, armed with her stellar reference from Bear, Janine went to work for Dr. Kathleen Holland at her newly opened pediatric clinic in Kerrville, which was about an hour outside of San Antonio. Dr. Holland had worked with Janine at Bear and had even testified on her behalf during the sham of an investigation. Dr. Holland had been advised by others to not hire Janine. However, Dr. Holland thought that Janine was a victim of the male dominated medical patriarchy. And I am sure that the patriarchy in 1982 Texas was alive and well, and I am 100% behind women helping women. Having said that, maybe Dr. Holland wasn't privy to the medical records of the instances of harm and death while on Janine's shifts, but maybe, just maybe, she should have looked a little deeper into the obvious issues.
It does seem like that might have been the right move.
I mean, to protect potential patients and really to also protect herself.
Yeah.
Shortly after Janine started working at Dr. Holland's practice, 7 children suffered seizures while in the clinic. Dr. Holland transferred each of these children via ambulance to nearby Sid Peterson Hospital. Dr. Holland did not think these incidents were suspicious, and because she was a specialist and not a generalist, she saw the sickest patients, so of course their conditions could rapidly worsen. Staff at the hospital, though, thought something weird must be going on with so many patients being transferred to the hospital in such a short period of time. Thankfully, these initial patients all recovered rather quickly once being admitted to the hospital.
The only case that prosecutors would later be able to link to Janine was the death of 15-month-old Chelsea Ann McClellan, who visited the clinic for routine immunizations. Chelsea's mom, Petty McClellan Weiss, when recalling that horrific day, said, quote, "She gave her her first shot in her left thigh, and she immediately started gasping for air. She gave her another injection, and she immediately just went limp and quit breathing." Chaos ensued, and an ambulance was called to rush Chelsea to the hospital. Somehow, and this isn't clear, Janine was able to board the ambulance and gave Chelsea a third and fatal injection. Dr. Holland had difficulty coming to terms with Chelsea's death. It didn't make sense. She didn't even come in with an illness. She had simply visited the clinic to get her vaccines. She wanted an autopsy. The autopsy would determine that Chelsea had died of SIDS, sudden infant death syndrome, a sudden breathing disruption, which is odd because Chelsea was 15 months old. SIDS usually happens to babies between 1 month and 1 year old. Also, SIDS mostly happens while babies are sleeping. To us, the puzzle pieces obviously don't fit. A doctor at Sid Peterson was similarly suspicious, so he began quietly looking into Janine. He found that there was a high number of deaths at Bayer while Janine had been employed there. He brought this to another godforsaken committee, but lo and behold, this committee realized there was a problem. Why had so many children become seriously ill and even died under Janine's care? The committee spoke with Dr. Holland and asked if she used succinylcholine, a powerful muscle relaxant at her practice. She acknowledged that she did have some at her office, but she didn't use it.
Dr. Holland told Janine about the meeting. Janine said she had found a bottle of succinylcholine and the cap was missing. This made Dr. Holland finally suspicious of Janine.
It's about damn time.
Right. On September 27th, while Janine was out of the office, Dr. Holland examined the bottles of succinylcholine. The bottles were almost full, but she noticed some tiny holes in the rubber stopper. Dr. Holland questioned Janine about the bottles. Janine suggested they just throw the bottles away to avoid, any pesky questions.
Yeah, let's just pretend this never happened. Seems like the right course of action when lives are at stake.
Not doing the right thing was really her jam. Dr. Holland would later learn that the bottles had been filled with saline. Someone had been using this debilitating drug, a skeletal muscle relaxant, which is supposed to be used to relax muscles during surgery or while on a breathing machine, not to paralyze and kill children. Janine, in an assumed diversion tactic, told Dr. Holland that she had taken an overdose of doxepin, which is used for anxiety and depression. She had her stomach pumped and she had not overdosed. She had taken 4 pills. She faked her reaction to this small dosage and acted like she was in a semi catatonic state. Dr. Holland, finally on guard, noticed that another bottle of succinylcholine had been ordered but was missing. Taking quick action, finally, I'm not really sure it's quick, but Dr. Holland fired Janine on September 28th. This may have been too little, too late. Sid Peterson revoked Dr. Holland's hospital privileges. Families were leaving her practice. Her husband even filed for divorce. And she was concerned that Janine would try and blame her for her own actions.
I mean, I do feel bad for her. She maybe should have given Janine the side eye sooner, but she didn't kill anyone.
It's true.
About a week after the funeral, Petty went to her daughter's grave with fresh flowers. As she was approaching the headstone, she noticed Janine there. Janine was kneeling on the ground, sobbing loudly. Petty asked Janine what she was doing there. Janine seemed really out of it, got up without saying anything, then walked away from the gravesite. Petty noticed that Janine had left a small bouquet of flowers, which wasn't odd, but she had also taken a bow from the grave. As we're sure you're aware, it's common for killers to take a token from a victim to remember the kill. Petty would later learn that Janine had injected her daughter 3 separate times with succinylcholine, and it had stopped her heart. Chelsea's death, thankfully, launched a criminal investigation, which allowed prosecutors to look at prior mysterious deaths at Bexar County Hospital. On October 12th, 1982, a Kerr County grand jury convened to hear findings regarding the children from Dr. Holland's clinic who had developed emergency respiratory problems, as well as the one who had died, Chelsea. Chelsea's body was exhumed and her tissue was examined with a new test that had just been developed in Sweden to determine if succinylcholine was present in the tissue. Not surprisingly, since Janine had injected Chelsea 3 times, the test showed that her cause of death was an injection of succinylcholine. In February 1983, a San Antonio grand jury was convened to look into a staggering 47 suspicious deaths at Bexar County Medical Center Hospital. These deaths had all occurred over the 4-year period while Janine was working in the pediatric ICU. Janine's former coworkers testified about Janine's questionable behavior, but there was no proof.
Maybe if the hospital took the position of protecting its patients, keeping adequate records, locking up the medication cabinet, and behaving in a way that you would expect, documented proof would have been available.
Imagine that.
Two former Bear employees, in addition to Janine and Dr. Holland, were all questioned by both grand juries. Chelsea's parents filed a wrongful death suit and named both Janine and Dr. Holland. Dr. Holland was cooperating with the DA's office and provided information regarding the tampered with and missing bottles of succinylcholine. The Kerr County grand jury were the first to indict Janine on one count of murder and charges regarding the injuries to the 7 other children who had been injected with the succinylcholine but survived. For these crimes, Janine faced a possible sentence of 99 years and was held in the county jail in lieu of a $225,000 bond. In November 1983, the San Antonio grand jury indicted Janine for the heparin injection of 1-month-old Rolando Santos, who very nearly died. Janine was also suspected in other infant deaths at Bear. Administrators at various clinics where Janine worked appeared appalled and aghast at these horrible crimes. They were also rather shamefaced at the fact that they had been happy to turn a blind eye when they knew something wasn't right and chose to do nothing. While awaiting her separate trials, Janine said she was receiving death threats. However, these supposed letters bore the same handwriting and misspelled words from a letter Janine had sent to a former coworker.
Try harder, people.
I mean, people are generally not nearly as smart or crafty as they think they are.
Usually not. Janine's first trial concerned the murder of Chelsea McClellan and injuries to other children under her care while working at Dr. Holland's clinic. It began on January 15th, 1984, and prosecutors argued that Janine had a hero complex. She took the children to the edge of death so she could then bring them back and be celebrated as their savior. Witnesses testified that she would tell one coworker that she had injected a specific medication and then would turn around and tell someone else that she had used a different drug. Her behavior was suspicious, to say the least. Janine seemed to thrive on the attention and excitement that surrounded an unexpected emergency regarding a child. The children were vulnerable and unable to tell on her. They were at the mercy of her actions. This was a form of Munchausen by proxy, or factitious disorder imposed on another, wherein a person either fabricates or induces illness in another person, almost always a child, to gain attention and sympathy. The jury deliberated for only 3 hours, and on February 15th, 1984, Janine was convicted of murder and given the maximum sentence of 99 years. Dr. Holland settled the legal suit brought by Chelsea's parents for an undisclosed sum. In October 1984, the trial for injecting Rolando Santos at Bexar County Hospital concluded, and Janine was found guilty and sentenced to 60 years in prison. This brought the total sentencing to 159 years, however, with the possibility of parole. Janine was suspected in other deaths at Bear, but again, in a flagrant disregard for the law and protecting vulnerable patients, some of the hospital records from the time Janine had been employed were destroyed. In fact, Bear shredded 9,000 pounds of pharmaceutical records, thereby destroying potential evidence.
I feel like the hospital should have been adorned with a large banner reading something like, "We will most likely, maybe, do our best to treat you, but if someone fucks up, we will destroy the records and you will have no recourse."
I feel like they should have been prosecuted for that. Surely that's evidence tampering.
I agree. They consistently had their heads in the sand and basically just refused to do the hard thing, the right thing.
Yeah. In their book, Murder Most Rare: The Female Serial Killer by Michael D. Kelleher and C.L. Kelleher, the chapter on lethal caretakers states that these murderous caretakers, quote, embody an especially pernicious darkness in our humanity by systematically attacking the weak and defenseless who have been involuntarily placed into her care or must rely on her for comfort and support. They commit their crimes in clinics and institutions where medications and syringes are abundant and where they are often able to hide their behavior for long periods of time. They pick patients whose deaths are, to their way of thinking, explainable because they are suffering from a weakened or near fatal condition. The authors sum up this motivation by stating that these patients are easy to kill and the murders are easy to cover up. The authors further state that ego and compulsion for domination motivates these carers. Quote, she is obsessed with the need to control those who are completely dependent on her. Janine, though, was also motivated by the need for attention.
Even with these deservedly long sentences, Janine was scheduled to be released in 2018 due to Texas's mandatory release law, which allowed inmates convicted of violent crimes between 1977 and 1987 to be automatically released if their good behavior credit plus their time served equaled their sentence. Thankfully, the law changed in 1987 to rightly exclude violent criminals. Prior to 1996, the Texas Board of Pardons and Parole were to release certain categories of inmates automatically. The law changed after 1996 when apparently the Texas legislature became uncomfortable with automatic release. And I am still having some difficulty wrapping my head around Janine being sentenced to 159 years. What kind of magic math would have existed to calculate her good behavior plus time served that she would have been eligible for early release if she had to serve 50% of her sentence? That would be 79 and a half years. If she started serving her sentence in 1984, that is 34 years. She must have had a massive amount of good behavior points to become eligible for early release. I mean, make it make sense. Also, it's probably just me, but how about we leave the rapists, pedophiles, and of course, murderers in prison and lighten the overcrowding by releasing minor drug infractions.
You know, you're preaching to the choir. I'm not saying criminals can't be rehabilitated. I'm just saying some criminals can't be rehabilitated.
1,000%. Patty McClellan, Chelsea's mother, was alarmed when she found out that Janine was scheduled to be released. Working with Houston victims advocate Andy Kahan, they led a campaign to press prosecutors to take the only step possible to keep Janine locked up: new murder charges. That effort went nowhere until the election of a new Bexar County district attorney, Nico LaHood, in November 2014. An aggressive young assistant DA named Jason Goss, who was just 1 year old when Genene Jones committed her crimes, began looking through decades of old, dusty boxes of discovery from the investigation.
Aware of this upcoming release date, prosecutors were determined to stop it. They filed new charges against Janine in 2017. Former Bexar County District Attorney Nico LaHood said they had evidence that showed Janine killed Joshua Sawyer with a deadly dose of Dilantin. Dilantin is an anti seizure medication, but it can be fatal in large doses. As we mentioned earlier, Joshua arrived at Bear's ICU on December 8, 1981, in a coma and suffering from seizures due to smoke inhalation after a fire destroyed his family's home. Although he was in a coma, an EEG allowed doctors to test for brain activity, and the results showed promising signs. After a few days in the ICU, his seizures had stopped and he was improving. Then the angel of death, which is what the press has dubbed Janine, started caring for Joshua, and his condition suddenly took a turn for the worse. He suffered multiple cardiac arrests before his heart finally stopped. Lab results would show that he had more than double the prescribed dose of Dilantin in his system. Prosecutors worked tirelessly to find evidence of Janine's suspected killings. DA LaHood stated, "Our intention is to hold her accountable for as many deaths as the evidence will support. But we have to have the evidence. So we will continue to work within the confines of the law to do that. We are going to take one at a time. I'm fairly confident we are not going to get 60 indictments on her, but we will get as many as the evidence supports." Janine was charged with the murder of three more children: Richard Ricky Nelson on July 3rd, 1981, Paul Villarreal on September 24th, 1981, and Patrick Zavala on January 17th, 1982. All of the children were allegedly injected with high doses of muscle relaxers or painkillers.
DA LaHood brought the first of the new murder charges in March 2017, accusing Janine of killing Joshua Sawyer with a massive overdose of Dilantin. Four more indictments followed, each carrying a $1 million bond that would ensure Janine would remain incarcerated pending trial, even after her mandatory release date. DA LaHood was defeated in a 2018 primary race against his one-time law partner, Joe Gonzalez. This sparked fear that Janine's case would be abandoned. This fear was unfounded. DA Gonzalez assigned Catherine Babbitt, his veteran major crimes chief, to lead the trial team. Janine's lawyers tried to get the indictments thrown out, but the judge rejected these motions. Being a badass and strong advocate, Patty McClellan provided support to to other mothers who testified before the grand jury. Petty attended every court hearing and meeting with prosecutors, but sadly, Petty died suddenly in June 2019 at the age of 64.
But good on Petty. Seriously, go her.
She's an example of a selfless person who, after an immense tragedy, does not curl up in a fetal position and block out the world, but truly wants to help others get justice.
Definitely.
Janine had shown a willingness to plead guilty to lesser charges that would keep her in prison, but she did not want to plead to murder. Apparently, optics were important and she didn't want to be known as a serial killer.
I don't think women who kill children fare well in prison.
I'm sure you're right. Even most prisoners have some kind of moral code. DA Babbitt submitted to Janine's attorneys a list of 200 potential witnesses and 97 different criminal acts that they may raise during trial. Janine's attorneys, overwhelmed by the discovery, now raised the potential of a plea deal. The deal allowed for the dismissal of the four other murder charges. However, all five families would be able to give victim impact statements.
Dressed in scrubs, wearing dark glasses with short gray hair, Janine ambled into the courtroom with the help of a walker. After confirming and signing her guilty plea, she was required to remain in the courtroom while the judge and family members spoke. She sat stoically, looking down with no emotion. Connie Weeks, Joshua Sawyer's mother, told Jones, "I'm glad that you will never see daylight. I hope you live a long and miserable life behind bars. And I'm sure as hell not going to begrudge her for that."
No.
On January 16th, 2020, Janine was sentenced to life in prison after pleading guilty to the death of Joshua Sawyer on December 12th, 1981. This plea allowed Janine to avoid the trial that was scheduled to begin in February 2020, although who knows how COVID would have impacted her trial. The plea required Janine to serve 20 years before being eligible for parole, with credit for the 2 years she was behind bars awaiting trial, meaning that Janine will be eligible for parole when she is 87 years old. DA Babbitt said, "If the parole board wants to deny her every time she comes up and keep her until she takes her dying breath, that's their prerogative and our preference. Why on earth would she be allowed to walk among us?" And too true. This plea cements Janine's status as a serial child killer and finally ends the decades long saga to keep Janine incarcerated. The five victims ranged in age from 3 months to 2 years. This sentence fulfills the goal of many victims' relatives, who for years have pressed San Antonio prosecutors to bring new murder cases to block Janine's release. Both attorneys Goss and LaHood were in attendance to see the case they initiated brought to conclusion.
District Judge Frank J. Castro said, "Miss Jones, something has to be said for you taking the plea to life on this murder, but it doesn't come close to what you did to these families and the tragedies that you caused. You took God's most precious gift, babies, defenseless and innocent, but I truly believe that your ultimate judgment is in the next life." And you gotta love when a judge brings God into his comments, though this was, of course, Texas.
I would have been a bit surprised if he hadn't.
True. DA Babbitt said that Janine's victims were not only children, but they were often critically ill children, and for her to decide on her watch who lived and who died is nothing short of evil. The odds are that she will take her last breath in prison. Authorities have speculated that Janine may have killed as many as 60 children during her time as a nurse. If this is true, that would make Janine one of the worst serial killers in American history. As we've mentioned, it isn't completely clear what exactly motivated the murders. We have touched on Janine possibly suffering from a hero complex, factitious disorder imposed on another, or extreme attention seeking. It is also speculated that Janine murdered these vulnerable children to feel powerful and important, instigating a life and death medical emergency.
I know we're covering both factitious disorder and factitious disorder imposed on another in our next episode, so that might be clouding my judgment. But given how Janine pretended to be sick herself, it sounds like she might have had both due to her desperate need for attention.
I mean, that's a good point. We are, of course, not psychiatrists,
Obviously not.
but I think she most likely did.
In a 2011 letter to the Texas Board of Nursing, Janine also appeared to admit to the crimes for which she was imprisoned. Her license, which was suspended in 1986, 2 years after her murder conviction, was ultimately revoked in 2011, 27 years after she was found guilty. Janine said, "I look back now on what I did and agree with you that it was heinous, that I was heinous. My only defense is that I was not of sound mind then or any time before 1994. That is not an excuse, just a fact. God, in his infinite wisdom and mercy, granted me a sound mind upon receiving him as Lord of my life." This is Janine's perspective. But when she was examined by psychiatrists in the 1980s, and again after the 2017 indictments, She was determined to be competent and sane to stand trial. The plea deal also allowed Janine to get her Bible back. The book, along with an address book and other personal items, had been seized from her prison cell as evidence in the case.
Stephen King has said that the character of Annie Wilkes in the book Misery is loosely based on the crimes of Genene Jones.
That is interesting.
I've only seen the movie, not read the book, but the concept of a caregiver hurting you is obviously horrifying. And unfortunately, as we are breaking our female killer nurses into two separate parts, more true than we would hope.
Absolutely. Next week, we'll be continuing our series on female killer nurses when we discuss the case of Beverly Allett. All the sources we used for this episode are in the show notes below. If you'd like to suggest a case or theme for us to discuss, feel free to email us at terrifyinglytypicalpodcast@gmail.com. You can also follow us at terrifyinglytypicalpodcast on Instagram and at terrifyinglytypicalpod on TikTok. Leave us a comment below to let us know what you thought of the case. We'd love to hear your opinions.
See you next week.